Welcome to the UN Talks webinar on tackling the infodemic of COVID-19, also sometimes referred to as information pollution. The UN Talks seminar series is co-hosted between UNDP Sweden and the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. My name is Malin Herwig, and I'm the acting director of UNDP's Oslo Governance Center, and I will be moderating our discussion today. This UN Talks and this series of now webinars, but before in-person events, they aim to promote critical reflection and a deeper understanding also of the United Nations, typically here in Sweden, but now that we can do it via webinars, we know that we have very many participants actually from different parts of the world. And I will soon get to introduce our speakers today, but they are sitting in fascinating parts of the world. Only few of us in sunny Stockholm, and the rest come from New York and Somalia. Very, very fascinating that we can organize this kind of talks today. Before we get into the substance, just a few notes on the technicalities. You will, all the participants will be muted and the video disabled. So don't worry if you don't see, or as long as you can see the speakers, then everything is working well. If you have questions, you can still submit them via the Q&A function, not the chat function, but the Q&A. Many of you have already sent in questions, so thanks for that, but it's still possible to do so, and my colleagues are helping to sift through them. We can't maybe go through them all, but we will do as good as we can. Also, please, we will want to maintain a constructive and polite conversation. So in the case that someone would abuse the space of the Q&A, we will remove that participant. This webinar is recorded and will be shared after the event. So as the world is grappling with the pandemic, it is also faced with information pollution, how we call it in UNDP, which is both the creation and the spread of false and misleading or manipulated or insightful information. And social media platforms are removing millions and millions of COVID-19 related informations every day. So, but as these are also maybe complicated terms, and we might also use different terminology among ourselves. Just a few words before we start of what we will be talking about here today. So there's misinformation, which we speak about when information is false, but maybe not created with the intention of causing harm. Then disinformation, we will use when information is both false, but also created with the intention of causing harm. And then, which maybe we'll talk less about today, malinformation. So information that might be used or based on real facts, but really manipulated to inflict harm on persons or a country. So the sheer volume of information about COVID-19 has, of course, compounded the problem and making it difficult for the public, for all of us to sift through and know what is true and what is false. And we have seen that the response to COVID-19 has been co-opted by economic purposes or for political reasons. We have also seen real life events and acts of violence and intolerance, which is often spurred on by online information. So information pollution is not only detrimental to the public health efforts, but also to the society and the democratic values, human rights, and social cohesion, which we are trying to contribute to. So just for a couple of examples before we kick off, Reuters have said that as an example, they found that 1/3 of social media users had reporting seeing false or misleading information about coronavirus. Or an Oxford study which tells us that those who believe in conspiracy theories about the virus are, which is maybe not so strange, less likely to follow regulations or recommendations given by a government. So this is some of the background to why we are here today to discuss misinformation and disinformation. And with me here today, I have a panel of distinguished speakers. So let me introduce them. First, we have Per Olsson Frid, who is the State Secretary to the Minister for Development Cooperation in Sweden. We have Melissa Fleming, Undersecretary General for the Global Communications at United Nations. And Jocelyn Mason, who is UNDP representative in Somalia. So we will begin now, and we'll invite each of the speakers to a few minutes of remarks and individual interventions. And then we'll have a quick exchange. Maybe they want to react to something the other person said. And then we will open up for question and answers, starting also with a few of those that you've already sent in today. So allow me then to open the webinar conversation with a question to you, Per. If you could maybe kick us off by explaining why it is vital to tackle the infodemic in parallel to the pandemic itself, and what are some of the major considerations or dimensions of this infodemic that need to be taken into account, and in particular for development cooperation? Thanks.
Thank you, Malin, and truly a pleasure to be joining you all for this conversation, and not least to be part of such a distinguished panel. I'm humble and very thankful for that. And indeed, this topic is increasingly important, I think, for all of us who works in development in different ways. I mean, first and foremost, of course, if to deal with any type of change, and we live in a rapidly changing reality, we all need to ensure transparency and to ensure access to reliable information. And as we all know, the right to health, for example, not only does it depend on reliable health services and access to health, but it also relies on the possibility for people to stay informed and make informative or informed decisions about themselves. And here again, safeguarding freedom of expression, freedom of information is key in this regard. Without that, it's impossible for anyone to make those informed decisions that you need to make to stay healthy, for example, or to help tackling a pandemic. And therefore also crucial to tackle disinformation or to deal with misinformation. And especially maybe that is important in a health crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Look, I mean, information travels fast. It travels faster than a virus even. And it impacts all decision making from government level down to in the individual decision making. And to make those best possible decisions, we all need also to access the best possible information. Not talking about the most amount of information, of course, but reliable and fact-based information. So we just don't need information, and we don't just need to tackle disinformation, misinformation, or malinformation, as you say, but we need to have help, and we need to help navigate in this great flow of information that is out there. This infodemic is a good expression, I think, for describing what we have to deal with parallel to dealing with the health crisis or the pandemic itself. COVID-19 also, just to say, I mean, it occurs at the same time as we see a backsliding of democratic values, of trust in democratic institutions, in democracy even. And this has seriously restricted the freedom of movement, freedom of expression, not least for journalists and media workers already before COVID-19 hit us. So disinformation and misinformation and malinformation with COVID-19 and those restrictions that have been put on human rights and freedom of information and expression as a consequence in the light of COVID-19, let's say, it risks to further undermine trust in democratic institutions, in public institutions, and respect for rights and as well as sustainable development as such. So the spread of this disinformation risks, hindering an effective approach, an effective response to the pandemic, but also undermines all other public efforts to build back better, or to easier the hit from this pandemic. We now see in many parts of the world that hasn't even had its first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. We see that the economic and social consequences of the pandemic precedes the health crisis itself. So we see secondary impacts already come before the first impacts. And also here, of course, reliable information, the ability to make decisions is key to be resilient to these changes and that we see, and especially people and populations that are already vulnerable, those that were already left behind, are of course now in even greater risk, also due to this information flow. So I just to finish off, yes, we live in a time where we have more access to more information than ever through the internet and so on. But it's also a time when it's more difficult than ever to know what is reliable information and what is not. So to tackle disinformation and misinformation must be also making sure that we help people navigate in this great flow of information, to make those reliable, to access the reliable information to make good decisions for themselves and also for their societies. So just in a development perspective, as we reprogram our support to partners in the development system, be it other countries or UN funds and programs, for example, it is important for us not only to reprogram and direct support into the health sector as we tackle a health crisis, but we also need to direct and reprogram and direct financial support, political support into the human rights and democracy sector to ensure that media and journalists have space to work, that civil society have space to work, so that we have a freedom of information and freedom of expression that is reliable and true. So we also create a space for accountability, because this is the second part of making, having reliable information, making informative decisions. We also need to have a space for accountability so that we can follow up on those decisions as decision makers go on. So Malin, just a couple of thoughts from my side on this first question. Looking forward to the rest of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Per, for starting us off. And Melissa, I would like to turn to you now, because from a global perspective, the UN Secretary General has put this very high on his agenda. So why is that? And from the United Nations, what would you, or how could you explain the global response that is taken to try to stop the spread of misinformation and disinformation on COVID-19? Melissa, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to also, Maren, echo and reinforce what Per has just said, that we're in a situation where trusted communications, is obviously, and we all know this, essential in any public health crisis. But where does the UN come in? This is a crisis unlike anything that we've ever seen. It's not just any health crisis. It is a pandemic that is rendering, even powerful countries almost helpless. And not to mention, this is hosted by UNDP, the countries that we're most concerned about, the vulnerable countries of the world. And we have Jocelyn here from Somalia with us, and the effect of this on human health is one thing, but the way it is upending livelihoods in all corners of the world is another. And we're also exposing everything that the UN has been working for with the Sustainable Development Goals where we haven't achieved the Sustainable Development Goals, we're seeing, the worst effects of the impact of the coronavirus. So, obviously, what we're really concerned about in this talk here today is about misinformation, and we strongly believe that misinformation is making this virus much more dangerous. First of all, also we have to put into perspective that this is the first infectious disease that has hit the globe that is happening in the social media era, at a time when social media is really penetrating almost all corners of the earth, not everywhere, but really far reaching. That can be an advantage because when good information travels to people through the internet on their mobile phones, that's great. We can provide a good public service and people can inform themselves. But what we're learning from this pandemic is that that misinformation fiction is traveling faster than the virus. Fiction is circulating faster than fact. And this is really endangering the public health response. And ultimately, it's endangering people's lives. So one of the things, and I think picking up on also something that Per said is, and I think you in your introduction, Maren, is that it's not that good information isn't out there. It's that, and that people aren't searching for it, they are. It's just that the producers of misinformation and disinformation are often producing content that is slick. It is actually, it looks almost authentic. They're very good at making it seem like it comes from a trusted source. They'll take somebody with the title of a doctor and produce, for example, the Plandemic video that reached millions and millions of people, and that was basically saying that coronavirus is a hoax. This is what we're up against. There was, for example, a recent study by the British Medical Journal that concluded that 1/4 of the most viewed videos on YouTube about COVID-19 contained misleading information. And they also concluded that it was not that the WHOs and the global health authorities around the world were not uploading good information. It was just that it wasn't very appealing, it wasn't entertaining, it wasn't able to compete and to break through. So, even though that studies are showing that people are really hungry for reliable information, they're finding it really difficult to navigate the information glut. And so you asked me, what we're doing about it. We have now launched a campaign called Verified. And, beyond what I'm in charge of communications for the UN, we've never had more visits to our platforms. We've never had more followers on social media. WHO, it has record visitors and followers, but this is obviously not enough according to these studies. So this is why we've partnered with a communications organization called Purpose. So we've done some fundraising for it. And now we've founded this initiative called Verified. And in the words of the Secretary General, the aim is really to flood the internet with good information and to counter the misleading narrative. So just a few more words on this. Again, to quote the Secretary General, our position is we cannot cede our virtual spaces to those who traffic in lies and fear and in hate. And so we're doing a few things with the initiative Verified. One is we're trying to recruit the public because the online, what we've noticed is you can't just broadcast to people and think that they'll hear it. The way information is being shared these days is peer-to-peer through groups and very much kind of instinctive, quick sharing. So we're doing a lot of misinformation literacy, as we call it. And we're recruiting, and we've already recruited over 8,000. We're looking for more, what we're calling information volunteers or digital first responders who get a daily feed of our science-based information, also stories of solidarity, stories of good things happening, and asking them to be part of the good information war. And at the same time, and the last thing I'll say is that we are going to be working with the platforms, because there's only so much you can do with the public. We can educate the public, give the public the tools, give the public also the instinct to be more, to scrutinize what they're reading and what they're sharing. But we're also asking the main big tech platforms, without them, we're never going to win the misinformation battle, to work with us. One of the things we're asking them to do is on June 30th, and anybody who's watching here, we're going to be asking you also to join in. We're going to be doing a global pause day, and the idea of this day is to get into their mind this new slogan: take care before you share. And we will be really trying to educate people about, you know, this instinctive sharing that we're seeing all over the place that is really perpetuating misinformation and disinformation. We're asking people to first, you know, take a break, understand, but also even be part of it by taking down, flagging misinformation. And we're asking Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, YouTube, and other big platforms to please help us make sure everybody sees this. So thanks for letting me introduce all of this, Maren, and that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and it's inspiring to hear about the efforts that you're doing and that is going on, and also to know that there are attempts to address this problem at the global level. So let's maybe now move from the global to a country example. And Jocelyn, you are in Mogadishu, in Somalia. If you could tell us a bit about what UNDP, together with partners, are doing to try to address the problem of disinformation and misinformation in Somalia. Over to you, Jocelyn.
Thank you, Malin, and thank you for inviting me to this panel, which I must say I'm humbled to be on. I was very, very inspired by the previous two speakers, Per and Melissa. Let me give you just a sense of the state of play in Somalia. There are about 2,800 infections at the moment. 80 people have died, but these are the formal numbers. We are certain that the informal numbers are many orders of magnitude higher than that. Nevertheless, at the moment, we do not see the sort of exponential growth that we have seen elsewhere. So it may be taking hold a little slower than it is elsewhere in the world. And that may well be true of other parts of Africa as well. So what misinformation is out there? Somalis believe, or some Somalis believe, that COVID-19 is divine punishment, particularly on China for its treatment of the Uyghurs and Muslims. It has taken hold in America for similar reasons, because Americans mistreat and oppress Muslims. Rumors circulating are that the disease is spread by the African Union troops that are here, or from the airport, which is where the African Union troops are, as well as the UN and embassies. Others believe that the Somali population, others in the Somali population believe that COVID-19 is a foreign disease that good Muslims don't suffer from, and therefore they shouldn't be concerned. And yet others have notions about what sort of things they can do to prevent getting infected, like eating garlic or ginger. I would like to point out, and then this sort of goes to the points that both Melissa and Per have made, but I think some of the most toxic pieces of misinformation is that this is a sort of some form of divine punishment. And that's because it encourages people then to go to mosques or join large gatherings on the one hand, and also, and perhaps more ominously, it makes people who have been infected or who are trying to prevent themselves from being infected by wearing masks or washing their hands, for example, as somehow bad Muslims. And so increases the level of stigma that people feel around. And indeed, the use of face masks is very scant in this country. I just wanted to talk briefly about the narrative that has been coming out of Al-Shabaab, which is the main terrorist organization in this country. They started off on the 18th of March, their first statement about COVID, which was 2 days after the first formal case was identified, saying, not surprisingly, that the pandemic is a divine punishment for non-Muslims and non-believers, and that if you were a good Muslim and a believer, then you were safe. About a month and a bit later, their narrative changed slightly. They acknowledged that the disease was being spread in the country and that Muslims and good Muslims could be infected, but that the disease was a foreign importation, and that this reinforced their message to get rid of foreigners from the country. Only 2 weeks later, interestingly, they announced that they had analyzed the issue further and felt that, in fact, the disease represented a major challenge for the Muslim world, that good Muslims were moving around through different countries, and that they had created a commission with doctors and scholars and religious leaders to provide guidance for the population on how to confront the disease. So it's interesting to watch this shift where they're going from talking about the disease as only affecting non-believers to talking about themselves as being the main and in fact a much better provider of services to the population and the government itself. So this is the sort of misinformation that we're seeking to challenge. And so what has the UN family, and UNDP in particular, been doing? Our philosophy is to provide credible information, but not just credible information, but also credible information through the voices of people who are credible to the population, people who are culturally believable and locally credible. And to do this information in very large volume, to widely disperse it. We've worked closely with the Office of the Prime Minister, who set up a COVID-19 task force, and of course there are a number of different agencies that are working very closely together in this effort. And we have basically a four-pronged approach. The first prong is to go through sort of traditional media, and we reach about 10 million people this is television and radio, with public service announcements. But we've been working very closely, for example, with religious leaders, with the Ministry of Endowment and Religious Affairs, creating specific messages that combine religious messages with accurate information about the disease, with messages of peace. We've helped the mullahs to record, for example, these messages that they can then send over the loudspeakers in the mosques, and organized them to have such meetings as these, panel discussions on the topic on television and on radio. And of course, we've also developed a whole number of our own very sort of catchy types of spots and so forth that go out under the overall aegis of the government. We've also helped the government put together a hotline and a website so that people can then be directed towards information and do their own research. The second prong is social media, and that reaches about 2 million people per month, but on our own handles. But of course, we expect that these would be then reposted or retweeted by, first of all, the celebrities that we work with, and I'll come to them in a moment, but anyone else. And we've developed a whole range of messages that are catchy and engage people on this. And one actually somewhat unusual, not even social media mechanism, is we've aligned ourselves with the cell phone company, the largest one here, Homewood, to put messages on the cell phone. So every time the cell phone rings, a message about COVID-19 comes out. And that, of course, reaches millions of people because the cell phone network penetration is very deep. The third point is to work with celebrities. So one example is that we're working with the most famous singer in Somalia, a man called Armanta, and he's brought together a whole number of other very famous singers to create a sort of We Are the World type of song. That these are all people that are terribly well known to everybody here, providing messages and so forth. We've also got together with a band that has, over the last couple of months, this song and dance that this band put together has been disseminated all over the place. We've commissioned a comedy troupe to put on shows on television, cartoonists. All of these are well-known figures and celebrities within the community. The final point is to actually use the networks that we as UN agencies already have. So as I've mentioned, we already had, through our Preventing Violent Extremism work, have a strong connection with not only the Ministry of Religious Affairs, but also with the ulama and other religious leaders. And for example, among other things, what we've been able to do is encourage them to close the madrasas. On the one hand, do that, but on the other hand, also to pay the teachers in the madrasas who would otherwise be reluctant to close them in order to be ambassadors and monitors of social distancing and appropriate behavior within their community. So they receive a small stipend to do this. And there are some interesting photographs out there of marketplaces in which pink and blue chalk lines are drawn at the appropriate distance from the stall, so the people who are buying their vegetables need to be leaning over to get the basket of fruit and vegetables they're buying. We're also linking with the Somali National Army so that they can send messages that have been taped over their loudspeakers on their cars, for example, in areas that we simply cannot reach. And there's large portions, especially in the south, and where Al-Shabaab predominates, and it's really only the army that can reach there. And also with the police force and the UN, various UN agencies are supporting the police, including UNDP, and they have a training manual as to what they should do, and in order to be better positioned to inform the public, but also be safe themselves. And of course, we've also done a lot of advocacy to try and release prisoners from jail, and they have done that. Not the worst offenders. So what has been the impact of this? Of course, it's very, very difficult to say. Behavior change is a long-term enterprise. It takes a couple of years or more, and it's very difficult to measure at the individual level. But there are some sort of anecdotal types of bits of evidence. For example, IOM did a couple of studies. One was done in the IDP, the internally displaced people's camps around Baidoa. And it was interesting to discover that as many as 60% of those people not only understood what COVID was and what they needed to do, but also that they had taken on board some of the messages from posters and videos that had been put out about how to make their own face masks and how to wear them properly. And another study of people on the move crossing the border into Somalia, also done by IOM, found that only 40% of these people even knew that COVID existed. Hard to make a link, but it suggests that some of this information, once people reach places where they're settling for in their internal displacement, actually are receiving the messages. So, but I think the key point here, and this goes to Melissa's point, yes, maybe this is among the first of the pandemics of this sort of size that we have been confronted in modern times and in the world of social media and easy media communication. But there will undoubtedly be others. So this is in some ways an effort also to start the process of making the public more susceptible to trusting the sources of information that we're supporting, and also to receive the messages in a productive way. So I'll stop there for a moment. Those are my comments for the moment. Thanks, Marlin, and thanks all.
Thanks, Jocelyn, and thanks to all three speakers. Really insightful. I'm just so happy to be able to listen to you today. We'll move straight into questions and answers, and we have got many questions already sent in when people registered for this event. There is still, however, an opportunity to ask more questions. You can use the Q&A function at the webinar, found typically in the bottom of the screen. I will kick off by actually combining two questions, Per, for you, to be able to go through more of them, since many people want to ask you. So one is, what is the role of governments in managing information pollution? But I would like to add another question that is kind of linked, which is, what do you think Sweden can do, maybe together with partners, to address the problem? Per, over to you.
Thank you, Malin, and I couldn't agree with you more. That's truly a pleasure to listen also to Melissa and Jocelyn. Such an insightful conversation. So thank you very much to my fellow speakers for that. I think now the role of governments is of course key, because usually, I mean, in this type, we see governments in charge of the health systems, of making sure that we can, provide that type of infrastructure needed to tackle the pandemic in different ways. But I also think that there's a strong role for governments to base their decisions on science, on fact-based, information. So that we don't have governments or representative of governments, which we unfortunately have, I'm afraid, that also spread misinformation, that also take decisions not based on facts, but on rumors or misinformation. And therefore, it makes it very difficult for the public to know who to trust. If there's someone who says we need social distancing because that helps now, and then you have decision makers going out to a pub, sitting really close to each other, saying that social distancing is not needed now. And in that type of environment, it is impossible for the public to take a decision on their own on how to protect themselves from a pandemic. So, I mean, of course, as leaders, it is extra responsibility that we base our decisions and our actions on reliable information and not on misinformation, and that we do not, we are not responsible of spreading disinformation or even malinformation in some sense. So that is of course one. The other one I would say is that the measures that we take to tackle the pandemic or any type of crisis for that sake, that is a measure, that those measures fit into the framework that the basic human rights principles and that we have agreed on, that it fits there, so that we don't break those fundamental normative rules that we set up for the world through these measures. So if we can respect human rights, if we can respect people's democratic space when we take measures, we also make it easier for people to access information and to also be able to somehow see if this information is reliable or not. But if we constantly push the boundaries away from rule of law, away from democracy, away from human rights and respect for the integrity and of the individual, then it's also making a lot more difficult for them to navigate in this infodemic, if I must say. And I think we've discussed, and I listened to Melissa and Jocelyn, and I hear there's lots of things going on, lots of good things going on making sure that the correct information is out there, using celebrities, using different systems, make the best out of social media to make sure that the right message is there. But we also, I think, need to work to provide media and information literacy to broader parts of our public and our populations, so that people also for themselves can seek information, can create information, can spread information in a correct way, can be critical to information that they hear. Because I think one thing for sure, and Jocelyn was on this is not the last pandemic in that we face, and it is not going to be less information technology out there and when the next one hits us. So if we can also provide and build resilience in a sense by equipping people with media and information literacy also, as well as these other measures, then I think we would be more equipped to tackle these types of things in the future. Malin, some thoughts, but over to you again.
Thanks, Per. And in terms of what you are doing, or as what Sweden is doing, is that part of supporting the the kind of deeper work that you were just referring to?
Oh, all right. Thank you. I know I forgot to mentioning that part. No, but we can see that we in the context where we bilaterally work with our development cooperation, we see through SIDA we reprogram. Of course, now to tackle the pandemic, trying to be more in terms of working on resilience, and strengthening health systems, but also making sure, for example, that there is that a radio channel is still being able to broadcast, so that the information can be spread. So we're now directing our reprogramming both into the more democratic human rights field and to the health sector parallel, because we see that both are needed. And I think as a partner country, we can help out with this, and through UNDP and all other UN funds and programs that we work with, having this type of conversation. How can we both tackle the health crisis and the rights crisis, and therefore also the access to information and so on at the same time? So it's an important conversation to have with partners, but it's also important that we direct our financial support in both of those streams. Now, I think, also we have to be humble. We are also hit by COVID-19. We're also having difficulties in taking decisions, trying to be as informed as possible, base our decisions on facts, on what researchers tell us is probably the best way to do so. And we have a strategy, and we can of course have a discussion in another forum if this is working the best or not. This is not the conversation to have, I think, now. But what I'm specifically proud of is that we have kept, or that we keep the freedom of information, the freedom of media, the freedom of expression untouched during tackling this pandemic. So we know for sure in Sweden that there will be a discussion afterwards on the strategies that was chosen, on who's responsible for what, and that there will be an accountability to that. And I think this is also something that we need to push in terms of partners. And I think UNDP can play a crucial role, having governance so clearly in its mandate, that when we help governments make reliable decisions based on reliable information, tackling the pandemic, to do so, allowing for an accountability process to take place, allowing for people to be able to question that, because that is when we can build also a democratic resilience in societies, which we need, because that builds trust, that's built positive social contracts. And I do think that positive social contracts makes us a lot better equipped to tackle pandemics than negative social contracts or social systems built on mistrust. Thank you.
Thank you, Per. Really, thanks. That was, I'm very glad that I got back to hear about the work in Sweden. Melissa, we have got a participant who is asking a question which I think is for you. Given the global politics in today's world, how can the United Nations navigate the politicized environment that we have to tackle information pollution within? So if you could give us some insight on how the UN is navigating the complex and political world to address the problem. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Malin, for that. And just to emphasize that, I think you've heard Dr. Tedros speak out over and over again that this virus cannot be politicized, and yet it is being politicized. And I think Per said it, expressed it very well, that we need leadership, we need leaders of nations to be setting the example for their publics. Otherwise, we're going to have a very hard time ever getting through this. I mean, you said it's not the first pandemic. It won't be, but it's going to be one that's going to be with us for a very long time. And we're seeing that every level of ways to fight the virus are being politicized, depending on the country, whether it is what we're very, very concerned about is the coming of the vaccine. We're very excited about it. We're excited about the incredible response all over the world, you know, over 100 potential vaccines in the making. And Dr. Mike Ryan from WHO, who's the emergencies director, has said, you know, this is our shot at the moon. We could actually reach the moon, do something we've never done before in human history. That is, develop a vaccine in record time. Usually they take maybe 7 years. We could perhaps in 1 year, maybe a year and a half, develop a safe, reliable vaccine. But we might face a problem that half the people in the world will refuse to take it. And then it will be for nothing. And this is because of misinformation and disinformation, and because we're living in an era where misinformation is dangerously spreading, and where certain leaders are not, you know, setting a positive example. I have to say, at the UN, I've never seen in my entire career, and I've worked at the UN for, I don't even want to say how long, but many years, but communications being taken so seriously in a crisis. We've had many crises. We've had wars. I used to work on refugee issues. But to be totally honest, I always felt that we were an afterthought, and I was always the head of communications fighting for, no, we have to have communications. It needs to be, you know, hat in hand with whatever crisis we're fighting. I think right now there's absolute recognition that this coronavirus crisis cannot be overcome without good information, and good information will help depoliticize. Good information based on science and facts will help provide misinformation literacy, as Per was saying. And this is absolutely one of the objectives of our verified campaign. And those of you who are listening, if you could join, please, it's shareverified.com, and sign up and be part of our effort. And information literacy and digital first responder. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Jocelyn, a quick question to you from Somalia. How does the UN work with other partners in tackling the information pollution, and what kind of partnerships are required?
Thanks, Marlin. Yes, I mean, well, I've alluded to some already. Let me first pick up the point that that Per made about, and Melissa followed on about, I think, Per, you put it very well, positive social contracts. I mean, it's important to remember that we're also working within a context. You know, we can't drop everything because COVID is happened. Somalia has extraordinarily painfully over the last decade moved from a very dark place where it was in a state of anarchy and tremendous amounts of violence to the frail beginnings of a state. And there is a state building process that's ongoing. So that shouldn't and can't be put on hold. There's the risk of politicization then undermining these blocks that are just being put in place. And I say that because I say, yes, the positive social contract that you mentioned, Per, is something that we have a responsibility to try and build beyond talking about and communicating about COVID. So that's why I mentioned we really need to be working with governments. The Office of the Prime Minister is the leader. They've done a fantastic job, actually. There's a very consistent set of messages. So there's no misinformation coming from government, interestingly enough. And even though this is a government that's highly fragmented and there are much political contestation, the government, the federal member states, within the government itself, between ministries and so forth. But so far, the messaging has been very, very consistent and very clear, and from our perspective, correct. I've also mentioned that, you know, but when you have a government whose credibility is being built from an almost non-existent base, you can't rely on government's messaging to be credible with the population and unpolitical. So you need to bolster that with precisely the types of partnerships that we've built up with private sector organizations like Hormud, that is highly respected because everybody has a cell phone, to all of these cultural figures. Now, just a little example of how we can, one of the things that we've done that has worked quite well is we went out with a competition for people to produce the best video about COVID and COVID messaging. And anybody can produce this. And so these messages then go out as messages from the population, from people who have produced their own video, and they get a reward. And the panelists who choose it are celebrities from the community, people who are well known. And one of these panelists is a poet, a woman. And poetry is one of the main art forms of this country. It's the principal art form and the principal way of telling the story of the people in this country. And she has produced what is now a highly successful poem. So again, it's about going to sources that are truly credible to the population, but at the same time bolstering the credibility of the government in this case, because to lay the groundwork that then the government can be the mouthpiece for really important information in the future. One last point. We set up a center in London which brought together a number of journalists, all of whom are specialists on Somalia. Many of them are Somalis, but also Mary Harper, for example, who is a BBC journalist whose specialization is on Somalia, and use them as designers of key messages and to help us understand the mechanism for and the sort of sensibilities to messaging that we could use. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. And you now already touched upon what was going to be my next question to all of you, which is about helping to expand on solutions. So what can be done to tackle the information pollution? I would like then to maybe go back to you, Melissa, and both if you could expand, you mentioned already some solutions, if there are other solutions that you know of and how to implement them, but also maybe if you can just say maybe one more time, or what can individuals do? I think, you can help us send the last message also of what can individuals of the public do to be part of the solution. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Malin. Yes, I think that, again, we were asking people to sign on to shareverify.com to become information volunteers, where you'll be getting daily emails from us that will equip you with good content, factual content and resources, inspiration, stories of solidarity as well in communities and across borders, so that you can also share, but also with the kind of misinformation literacy. And I think just the knowledge that, it's becoming even less about that information is specifically false, but it's more misleading narratives and content that might have a kernel of truth, but is designed to raise your fear. People who are purveyors of misinformation, creators of disinformation, really understand there is a lot of fear out there and a lot of questioning, and it's obvious. And it's easy for somebody who traffics in lies and breeds on fear to build narratives that are black and white, whereas if you're a scientist or a responsible institution and organization, you have to speak with caveats. And this is a virus that was unknown. There's so many unknowns still. And science is something that needs to continually be explained. But the better we get, not just as the UN, as governments, as responsible governments, like what I'm hearing from Sweden, as institutions, as country operations, but as the more we can help the public to be part of this by equipping them with the understanding of what's coming at them in this digital age, in the middle of a pandemic. I think that's really key. So we're welcoming, we're not just going to be the broadcasters, but we're trying to recruit hopefully hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around the world who will join us in being part of our verified team to fight the information that will keep us safe, fight the misinformation that will keep us safe, because really misinformation can destroy lives and good communication can save people.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I'm sure that we'll have many more signing up after today. Per, last words over to you. If you could spend a couple of the last minutes of this webinar to speak to us about solutions from your perspective.
Well, thank you, Malin. I think solutions is always difficult because we don't really know, of course, what is the right formula for the way forward. But I think at least some things from our side is that first of all, we definitely need to continue and enhance support to free and independent media, to strengthen the freedom of expression and access to information. And to work on more general media and information literacy. All of these things I've been touching upon already. But again, also, important that we now make sure that the measures that we take to tackle the pandemic is then again not used as an excuse to limit the rights of freedom of expression or democratic space in any way. But apart from this, I think also we need now to make sure that we also bridge the digital divide that we have, because the way forward is going to be digital, and to make sure that more people have access to those digital tools to both detect, expose, and prevent the spread of disinformation and misinformation is really a critical part of the solution. But also then to have access and be able to access the correct information and to follow up and to find and search for information and news, and not just be having to rely on what maybe the elders in the society tell them, or what you can hear from religious leaders or from political leaders for that sake, but being able to have that critical approach, then you need access, and then therefore you also need to bridge that digital divide. I think, the media policy-wise, I think there needs to be more of a global conversation between government, between media, tech companies, civil society, and others on issues like regulation, self-regulations, to strengthening the sort of professional media standards globally on this. I think you shouldn't use maybe legislation too much to limit what information can be spread and so on, because then it's very, very easy that you go too far and you then also limit the freedom of information, freedom of expression. But there needs to be a conversation, I think, globally on self-regulation, on standards, which I think is good if this comes from and sparks from within the media industry, for example, and the big tech companies. I would also want to stress the importance of civil society as part of the solution. Through our development cooperation, we support a number of organizations working to strengthen the access to correct and pedagogical information, let's say, including digital tools for fact-checking and so on. And civil society is also important here to be able to work on the accountability parts, as I was part of before. But let me finish off by saying that I'm really happy that we, as an example to the new partnerships that need to be founded in this age, Sweden and UNDP will together work to tap on the experience of the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency, who has an extensive crisis response experience, and to start implementing projects in over 20 countries to help them use technology to tackle misinformation and disinformation. I think that the solutions are out there. and maybe they're just not among those who have access to the tools to scale up or to spread those solutions. But with partnerships and new partnerships, I think we can reach very far. And I think that the only thing that is really important is that we try to bring those solutions forward, that we try to reach them, that we do our best to tackle both the pandemic and the infodemic. And if we do so, we can allow for the next generation to find solutions to their challenges, so that we just don't pass on challenges all the time. But if we can find solutions here and now, we can let the next generation find solutions for the challenges that they will have. And we know that there will be more challenges ahead. And that is the obligation that we have. And to do so in a transparent way, so that we can allow for people to hold us accountable for the decisions we make. And I think those are key elements in any type of solutions right now. Malin, I thank you for the ability to be part of this conversation, to join this talk, and again, back to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Per, and I am glad that you brought up the issue of protection of media and the role of civil society, and not the least the importance of civic space. I'm afraid that we will have to conclude now. Our 1-hour webinar is already up. That is the challenges when we have them online. On the other hand, the opportunity is that we can really connect around the world. I'm inspired to have listened to the many ideas, both practical and in terms of rights and values when it comes to solutions and the way forward. So thank you for that. And on behalf of the co-host, UNDP and the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, thank you so much to our speakers. And also thanks to the participants, and many thanks for those of you who sent in questions. As we are ending now, there is 1 minute left in the webinar where those of you participated, if you could look in the chat function, you will see a link to a very quick survey. It would be of great importance for us if you could just answer those questions, as they help us improve and know how we are doing with these webinars, so that we can advance them for the future. But with that said, thank you so much to the speakers and the participants on the important topic of information pollution.
Thank you, Malin. What a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Indeed, a pleasure.
Pleasure, Per, Melissa, as well.